It is without a doubt that Japanese uses a comparatively high number of foreign words, increasingly also taken from the English language. For Japanese learners, this is usually a source of joy as they get to learn a piece of the language without having to battle the kanji. For others, some of these expressions might be a source of amusement or confusion. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen funny slogans or prints on t-shirts and hats. In this video, I want to look at loanwords in Japanese, the different types of loanwords there are, and why they exist in the first place. There will also be a second part coming out in which I will pick up again on a concept introduced in this video, pseudo-anglicisms, and explain it again in greater detail. Without further ado, let's first have a look at the Japanese lexicon. The Japanese lexicon is comprised of multiple layers, with different groups of words entering the Japanese language from various other languages at different points in time. Without going into too much detail, the modern Japanese lexicon can generally be divided into three categories. Owago, also called Yamato kotoba, are the native Japanese words that have been part of the Japanese lexicon since before borrowings from other languages started. Many verbs, adjectives, and especially grammatical particles belong to this group of words. Kango, also called Sino-Japanese, describes words that have been borrowed from Old or Early Middle Chinese, and many nouns and pseudoverbs belong to this category. This category does typically not include modern borrowings from Chinese or Cantonese, however. These and many other foreign words that entered the Japanese language in more recent times are called gairaigo, loanwords, and are most commonly nouns and not adjectives. And it is this last group of words that I want to have a closer look at today. Definitions in this field of linguistics aren't always 100% clear, and the lines between different categories definitely do blend, so that it is not always possible to say that this is definitely this and not that. Generally speaking, loanwords are words that have been borrowed from one language into another, which just means they have been taken and to a certain degree assimilated to the new language. We will get back to what exactly that assimilation can look like in just a second. In the case of Japanese, there used to be a lot of borrowing from Portuguese, Dutch, and German due to the close contact to those nations a few hundred years ago, resulting in words like beranda, botan, castera, tabaco for Portuguese loanwords, arukoru, Deutsche, Kohi for Dutch loanwords, and a bunch of medical terminology like Allergie, Neurose, Röntgen from German. Then, in more recent times, of course, the main source language, the language from which the most words have entered Japanese, has become English, resulting in words like internetto, chiketto, basu, and so on. There are a few cases where double borrowings happened. For example, the word glass was first borrowed from Dutch and later again from English. One as garasu, glass the material, and one as gurasu, glass the thing you use to drink. Now, these examples are really nothing special. Most languages have loanwords from other languages, especially English obviously, and there's nothing really fun or amusing about them. If anything, they make a Japanese learner's life a little easier, and that's about it. Before moving on to some of the more interesting examples, let me first talk about what I meant when I said that loanwords get assimilated to their new language. Assimilation can happen on multiple levels, but for Japanese the most urgent one is obviously the adaptation into the Japanese writing system, and thereby the necessity to assimilate the new word into the Japanese sounds and syllable structure. If you've made it this far, I will just blindly assume that you know that Japanese uses a syllabary, meaning they use characters to represent a syllable rather than single letters that are supposed to represent single sounds. Their syllable structure very generally follows a consonant-vowel pattern, which is a lot less complex than a lot of other languages. And if you have no idea what I just said, I recommend you to check out the other video I made specifically on the Japanese sound inventory and phonotactics. The smaller sound inventory and restrictive syllable structure of Japanese make it difficult for many foreign words to be added to the Japanese vocabulary as they are, so they need to undergo extensive change. This can be especially true for many of the early borrowings, as they were often adapted based on how the word was spelled rather than how it was pronounced. And we all know how English spelling, for example, can be all over the place sometimes. Nowadays, most words are borrowed based on how they're pronounced, and new kana combinations have been introduced to be able to better represent sounds that do otherwise not occur in the Japanese language. Some examples are t, made by a big te and a small i, for example in words like party, and fa made by a big fu and a small a in words like fashion. Many loanwords undergo additional word formation processes, sometimes to an extent that make it difficult to guess where a word even originated from. Take, for example, the word rimokon. Would you have guessed that this comes from remote control? What happened here is that remote control was first adapted to the Japanese sound and syllable structure. But the resulting word, remoto controlu, ended up being too long to be practical and was clipped to a more typical length of 4 mora by taking the first 2 kana of each word, resulting in rimokon. And this is where we start to get into slightly more interesting territory, because very often do borrowed words not only undergo sound changes, but also changes on other levels of the language. This can include changes in the meaning, changes in the usage and the connotation a word has, and even in the grammatical features. When this happens, we typically speak of pseudo-loanwords, or in the case of loanwords specifically from English, pseudo-anglicisms. And this is so common that they have their own term for this in Japanese,和製英語, English made in Japan. Again, the lines are blurry and sometimes it can be difficult to determine the difference between a loanword and a pseudo-loanword. For the sake of clarity, I will focus only on anglicisms, and I will consider a pseudo-anglicism to be a word that has undergone either morphosyntactic or semantic changes after already being adapted to the Japanese writing system. Since noun are the most common offenders, let me introduce you to some和製英語 terms that demonstrate how they're different from other anglicisms. Take, for example, the word paper driver. If you understand this video, then you understand the words paper and driver. Yet, if someone was to tell you that they're a paper driver, you might not know what that means. That could be that they are driving a really old car that would crumple like paper if it was to crash. Or maybe they are a really careful driver, as if they are driving on paper. In reality, a paper driver is someone who has a driver's license but doesn't use it. They're a driver on paper, but not on the road. This is a great example of how 1 plus 1 doesn't always add up to 2 in languages. Just because you understand or know the parts doesn't necessarily mean that you will understand the whole, because the semantics shifted and an additional meaning was added or created. Another slightly different example is my pesu, which is just my and pace, except the following sentence is perfectly normal Japanese. トムはのんきでマイペースだな. If we were to translate it somewhat literally, we would get something like Tom is easygoing and goes at my pace. What? Like he's following me? Or he's fine with whatever I do? Actually, no. This sentence has nothing to do with me at all. Even though in English my refers to the speaker, in Japanese it has become a prefix that just means oneself, referring to whoever is the topic of conversation at that point. So the sentence actually means Tom is pretty chill and goes at his own pace. Loanwords, especially pseudo-loans, are not bound by the grammatical restraints of the source language. So while in English we need to use the correct pronoun, his pace, in Japanese it would lead to confusion if we were to exchange the prefix mai to his, and it would actually result in an incorrect sentence. Another final example of this is the famous tagline of Pokemon. In Japanese, it is Pokemon getto daze, and you guessed it, getto is actually a loanword from the English to get, to obtain. Unlike in English though, where to get is a verb, in Japanese it is a noun, and again we're just changing word classes without consideration of the source language. As a final remark on和製英語, I would just like to point out that和製英語, just like other parts of the Japanese lexicon, are a fully functional part of the language, and are neither a sign of poor language quality or ability, nor are they intended to mock the English language. There's one final type of English usage that we can find not only in Japan, but to a certain extent all over the world that is still different from和製英語and deserves a brief mention here. And this is where we circle back to something I said at the beginning of the video. Funny signs and sayings on shirts or hats. Even though they are undeniably English words and their usage is removed from their original usage, they are to be considered a separate category than和製英語. Because in contrast to和製英語, this type of English, which is often referred to as Engrish or Japanglish, is more often than not used for purely visual or stylistic effects. You'll see that the words are not written in katakana, which obviously makes them stand out, and you would never see them used in everyday speech or text. The messages are often incoherent because they're not intended to be understood. And that brings me to the last thing I want to talk about today. Why use loanwords in the first place? Broadly speaking, loanwords fulfill one or more of three functions. They fill lexical gaps, they carry connotations of modernity, internationality, and sophistication, and they serve as euphemisms. Within each of these functional categories, the ratio of pseudoloans varies drastically. Let's have a closer look. As technology advanced and spread across the globe, there was a need to refer to these new concepts, tools, technology. Initially, attempts were made to use loan translations, so using already existing words and characters from Japanese. An example of this would be the Cold War that was translated with the characters for cold and war, resulting in the word reisen. However, this became increasingly difficult as more and more new technology emerged, and eventually they proceeded to just use loanwords. That is why you will find a lot more loanwords in areas like chemistry, engineering, computer science, compared to more traditional areas like sumo or karate. Since words in this category are there to represent foreign or new concepts, pseudoloans are actually rarely found in this category, since that would kind of defeat the purpose of representing a concept exactly the way it is. The second function loanwords can have is their connotation of modernity, internationality, and so on. This can often be seen in, for example, advertisements where a certain product or service might be advertised to be really fashionable or a brand new innovation. Pseudoloans are fairly common in this category because it is not so much the exact word that matters, but more so the effect it creates. For that same reason, the lifespan of many of these words is also rather short because once the general public has seen or heard a word enough times, it doesn't have that new feeling to it anymore, so they need to constantly be replaced. Similar to the previous category, this category relies on the connotation that English words have. In this case, however, it is not to sound sophisticated or international, but because the English equivalent of an already existing word in Japanese usually comes without the negative connotation. A pretty good example of this is the famous rabuho, love hotel, which sounds nice, but is really just a place people rent out for sexual activity. Another example would be the use of the word pinku. Sounds cute, maybe kind of girly, but usually refers to something erotic. So a pinku eiga is not a movie filmed in pink, but an erotic film. Of course, there are also words that do not directly belong into any of these three categories. Take for example the word doa. Openings to enter buildings are obviously not a concept foreign to the Japanese, so it's not like there was a general lexical gap that needed to be filled. The word doa is more so used to distinguish a specific type of door. And while it may have evoked a feeling of modernization initially, people today will hardly be impressed by an oh so fancy doa. If you've made it this far into the video, you successfully cleared level 1 of the Loanwords in Japanese series. I hope you enjoyed learning about all things loanwords. Let me know if you've ever come across a loanword that just made you shake your head. And if you're curious to learn more about pseudo-Anglicism specifically, stay tuned for part 2 of this series where I'll go into much more detail.